January 1893, 7:03 in the morning, cold sharp enough to split stone. The locomotive arrives where it arrives every morning, not at a public station, at the Esplanade, the workyard 3 miles uphill from Biltmore village, where 1,000 men build what will become the largest private house in the United States. Steam vents from the cylinders, brakes grip, the consist shudders to halt. 5 cars, 1 passenger car at the front, borrowed from the Southern Railway, windows, seats, enclosed space, warmth. Inside 60 stonemasons, Italians mostly, men who carved cathedrals before they carved chateau walls in North Carolina, skilled hands that command $3.50 per day. They step down onto the platform, breath visible, tools under arms. They walk toward the limestone blocks waiting to be cut, set, carved into ornament that will define this building for the next century. Behind the passenger car, 4 open freight cars, flatbeds, gondolas. No windows, no seats, no protection from January wind. Sitting on equipment, on supply bundles, on planking laid across metal floors, 940 men. General labourers earning $1 to $1.50 daily. Carpenters, blacksmiths, brickmakers, painters, the workers who dig foundations, mix mortar, haul beams, build scaffolding, the men whose labour makes ornamental stonework possible. They climb down stiffly, fingers numb, faces raw, 10 hours of work ahead, then 10 hours until the evening train returns them to the village. Same train, different cars. This is not an accident. This is not an oversight. George Vanderbilt, who purchased 3 steam locomotives for temporary use on a private construction railway, who spent $50,000, nearly $2 million in modern money on 6 years of rail operations, could have provided more passenger cars, could have enclosed the freight cars, could have distributed comfort more equally. He chose this arrangement. His engineers designed it, his supervisors enforced it. Every morning and every evening for 5 years, this train made hierarchy visible, made it physical, made it literal, same rails, different experiences. The infrastructure decided who sat and who stood, who stayed warm and who shivered, who rode in comfort and who rode exposed. The train doesn't ask who deserves passenger cars and who deserves freight cars. The train simply separates, by skill, by wage, by the value placed on particular hands. That separation is not a side effect of private infrastructure. That separation is the infrastructure. And the real question, the question this railway forces us to ask when one family builds their own railroad, when private wealth constructs entire transportation systems answerable to no one, when infrastructure becomes private property, serving private purposes, who decides who rides where, who decides what gets built, what gets dismantled, what leaves no trace, the answer is simple. Brutal, unchanged in 135 years. The person who pays for the rails decides everything else. Let's talk about what that means. Chapter 1. The Power Holder. To understand the railway, you have to understand the fortune that built it. 1877. Cornelius Vanderbilt dies in New York. The Commodore, steamship magnate, railroad baron, his estate $100 million. At that moment, in that year, this makes him the wealthiest man in the United States, possibly the wealthiest man in the world. $100 million in 1877. If you calculate that fortune as a share of national GDP in 1877 and apply the same proportion to today's economy, the number becomes 143 billion. That is not a typo. The Vanderbilt fortune, measured against the size of the American economy, would make Cornelius the second wealthiest person in United States history, behind only John D. Rockefeller. But Cornelius does not spend this money building mountain estates. He dies. The fortune passes to his son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who expands the railroad empire even further. New York Central, Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, the Canada Southern. By the time William Henry dies in 1885, the family controls rail lines from New York to Chicago, the first such connection, the infrastructure that makes transcontinental commerce possible. William Henry dies in 1885. His youngest son, George Washington Vanderbilt II, inherits $5 million outright, plus a $5 million trust fund generating substantial annual income. This adds to the $2 million George had already received from his grandfather Cornelius, and another $1 million on his 21st birthday. By age 23, George controls more than $10 million, roughly $300 million in modern currency, plus ongoing investment income from the family's railroad holdings, real estate portfolios, and financial instruments. What does that kind of wealth buy? Not just objects, not just houses or art or furniture. It buys autonomy. It buys the ability to say the systems everyone else uses do not suit my purposes. I will build my own. That is what George does. 1888. George visits Asheville, North Carolina with his mother. The town sits in a valley ringed by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air is cool, clean. The Southern Railway has recently extended service to the area October 1880. The first train arrives at what is then called Asheville Junction. Before that, the region was nearly inaccessible. Stagecoaches, wagon roads through mountain passes, the Swannanoa Tunnel, completed in 1879 after years of brutal construction, finally brought rail service across the Eastern Continental Divide. George looks at the mountains and decides this is where I will build. Not a summer cottage, not a Newport mansion for entertaining society, a year-round estate, a working property, scientific forestry, managed farms. A house large enough to hold his library of 10,000 volumes and his collection of European art. He begins purchasing land. Not a few hundred acres, not even a few thousand. 125,000 acres, nearly 700 separate parcels, over 50 farms, at least 5 cemeteries, entire communities, the village of Best, named for William J. Best, who owned the Western North Carolina Railroad, the community of Shiloh, families who had farmed this land for generations, all purchased, all consolidated under single ownership. An estate spokesman will later say that much of the land was in very poor condition, and many of the farmers and other landowners were glad to sell. Perhaps the region is still recovering from the Civil War's devastation. Extractive logging has stripped the forests. Soil exhaustion from careless farming, economic depression. People sell when they have no better options. George accumulates an area larger than many European principalities. Nearly 200 square miles, all private property, all answerable to one owner. Now the problem, how do you build the largest private house in the United States 3 miles from the nearest railway depot, across terrain described in estate records as alternating between deep hollows and ridges? The house George envisions will require 5,000 tons of Indiana limestone, millions of bricks, thousands of board feet of oak, chestnut and pine, copper sheets for the roof, marble for fireplaces, tile for floors and walls, electrical equipment, plumbing fixtures, heating apparatus, furniture, tapestries, decorative objects spanning 4 centuries. All of this must move from the Southern Railway depot in Biltmore Village, the renamed village of Best 3 miles uphill, to the construction site on a plateau overlooking the French Broad River Valley. Public carriers will not run a spur onto private property for private use. Even if they would, their schedules serve their priorities. George needs materials when construction demands them, not when a public railroad's freight routing permits. Wagon transport. Possible for some materials, impractical for limestone blocks weighing hundreds of pounds each. 287 rail cars full. Even with the best mule teams and the strongest wagons, moving that volume across 3 miles of mountain terrain would take years, would cost nearly as much as building a railway. George consults his team, architect Richard Morris Hunt, landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, civil engineers, the superintendent of the Richmond and Danville Railroad. They study the terrain, they calculate grades, they assess the challenge. The answer they return, build your own railway, standard gauge track, so the estate can use regular locomotives and rolling stock. 3 miles from the depot to the construction site, 5 trestles spanning the gullies. Temporary infrastructure, to be dismantled once construction completes. Estimated cost $50,000, nearly $2 million in modern currency. George approves. This is not unusual. Industrial spurs exist across the country, coal mines, lumber operations, steel mills, but most are shorter. Most serve extraction or manufacturing, not residential construction. This will be 3 miles of private railway, 5 years of operations, 3 steam locomotives, daily worker transport for 1,000 men, material delivery for a house that will not be surpassed in private residential scale for over a century. The official justification is engineering necessity, public systems inadequate, terrain impossible, construction timeline demanding. The private railway presented as the only practical solution. But here is what the railway actually enables: total control. No ICC oversight, no common carrier obligations, no published rates or public schedules. Complete authority over who rides, when they ride, how they ride. The ability to separate workers by class and race into different cars on the same train. Infrastructure as purchased exemption. When public systems prove inadequate for private purposes, sufficient wealth simply builds parallel systems. Systems that answer only to private owners. Systems that operate outside democratic oversight or regulatory constraint. The railway is not just transportation. It is a statement: I do not need your infrastructure. I can build my own, and if I build my own, I decide everything. Chapter 2. The Engineering. January 1890. Work begins. Not on the house, on the infrastructure that will make the house possible. The first crews arrive at what will become the construction site. They are not stonemasons or carpenters. They are railway workers, track layers, bridge builders. Men who know how to drive grade stakes and calculate curves and build structures that will carry 20-ton locomotives across mountain terrain. Frederick Law Olmsted stands on the plateau with a civil engineer and the superintendent of the Richmond and Danville Railroad. They study the land between Biltmore village and the house site, 3 miles, but not 3 flat miles. The terrain rises and falls dramatically. Deep hollows cut by centuries of water flow. Sharp ridges where bedrock breaks the surface. This is not land that welcomes straight lines or gentle grades. Olmsted proposes a solution that will become one of the project's engineering showcases. Do not fill the hollows, span them. 5 timber trestles, total length 1,052 feet. Each structure rises on carefully engineered bents, vertical supports spaced at measured intervals, cross-braced for lateral stability. The trestles carry the rails across the gullies while preserving the forest below. The principle is temporary impact. Build structures that can be dismantled without permanently scarring the landscape. The track itself standard gauge, 4 feet, 8½ inches between the rails. The same gauge used by the Southern Railway, by the New York Central, by virtually every major railroad in the United States. This is not an accident. Standard gauge means the estate can purchase locomotives and rolling stock from established manufacturers, can borrow freight cars from connecting carriers, can hire engineers and brakemen trained on conventional equipment. It also means something else. This is serious infrastructure, not a mine tramway or logging railroad with narrow gauge track that isolates it from the broader network. This is main line specification, built to handle the same equipment, the same loads, the same operational demands as any public carrier. George Vanderbilt purchases 3 steam locomotives. Engine number 75 arrives first, in 1890. It will later be renamed Cherokee, but initially it cannot do the job. The locomotive lacks sufficient coal capacity and water capacity to make the 3-mile run uphill while pulling loaded cars. The boiler pressure drops, the fire cools, the engine stalls. George orders modifications, larger tenders to carry more coal and water, upgraded fireboxes to maintain steam pressure on the grade. After rebuilding, Cherokee becomes operational, but it serves primarily as backup. The workhorse is a Baldwin locomotive, christened Biltmore. This engine runs daily from 1890 through December 1895, then intermittently into 1896 as operations wind down, pulling limestone, pulling bricks, pulling lumber and hardware and fixtures, and twice each day, pulling the consist that carries 1,000 workers from the village to the construction site and back. A third locomotive exists. The archives do not specify its make or model, but photographs show 3 engines at various times on the estate. Redundancy matters. When one locomotive needs maintenance or repair, work cannot stop. The schedule demands continuous operations. Parallel to the main line, another railway operates, narrow gauge, lighter track, smaller equipment. This line runs from the on-site quarry to the brickworks, raw materials in, finished bricks out, 32,000 bricks per day, every day, for 5 years. The estate is not just a construction site, it is an industrial complex, with its own internal transportation network, switching points, sidings, multiple destinations. The main line serves the esplanade, the primary workyard in front of the rising house, but spurs branch to the brick kilns, to storage yards, to workshops for carpentry, stone cutting, and metal work. 6 months of infrastructure work, rails laid, trestles built, locomotives tested, switching mechanisms installed. Water towers erected for filling locomotive tenders. Coal bins established for fuel supply. Only then, in summer 1890, do stonemasons begin setting the first blocks for the South Terrace retaining wall. The official story emphasises engineering sophistication, Olmsted's environmental sensitivity, the careful grading that protects forest while enabling efficient transport, the temporary nature of the system, designed for eventual removal without permanent damage. All true. The engineering is real. The environmental consideration is genuine. But the engineering also does something else. Something the official story mentions briefly. If at all, it separates people. The design of the daily worker transport is not accidental. One passenger car at the front of the consist, borrowed from the Southern Railway, enclosed, heated, with seats and windows, reserved for the 60 stonemasons, the men earning $3.50 per day. The skilled craftsmen imported from Italy and New York, the aristocrats of the labour force, as estate records describe them. Behind that passenger car, 4 open freight cars, flatbeds and gondolas, no enclosure, no heating, no seats, just metal floors and low sidewalls. This is where the other 940 workers ride, the general labourers earning $1 to $1.50 daily, the carpenters and blacksmiths and painters and brickmakers, the men who dig and haul and mix and build, every morning at 7, every evening at 5, same train, different cars. This arrangement is not a temporary expedient, not a matter of equipment availability. George Vanderbilt, who spent $50,000 on 6 years of railway operations, who purchased 3 steam locomotives for temporary construction use, could have acquired additional passenger cars, or built simple enclosed cars on freight chassis, or rotated workers through available comfortable seating. He does not. The arrangement persists for 5 years, 1,000 mornings, 1,000 evenings. The visible, physical separation of workers by skill and wage and the value placed on their comfort. The railway does not need this separation to function. The locomotives would pull the same loads whether everyone rode in passenger cars or everyone rode in freight cars. The schedule would not change, the route would not change, the materials would still arrive, but the separation serves a purpose. It makes hierarchy visible, daily, unavoidable. The men riding in the passenger car see the men in the freight cars. The men in the freight cars see the passenger car. Everyone understands where they stand. Infrastructure is not neutral. Track layout, car assignment, schedule control. These are design choices, and design choices reflect values. When one entity controls the entire system, that entity's values become embedded in steel and wood and operational practice. The railway is efficient, the railway transports workers safely, the railway delivers materials on schedule. The railway also teaches a lesson, twice daily, about who matters more. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Chapter 3. The Operation. 7 a.m. Every morning. 6 days a week. Through 5 years of active construction. The train leaves Biltmore village. The full workforce aboard. Destination the Esplanade. The workyard 3 miles uphill. Arrival time approximately 7:20. Departure time for evening return 5 p.m. No earlier train. No later train. No alternative. This is the schedule. The only schedule. If you work on Biltmore House, you ride this train. If you miss this train, you do not work that day. If you do not work, you do not earn wages. The estate controls when work begins, when work ends, when workers move. Consider the alternative. 3 miles, uphill. Mountain terrain with grades steep enough to require 5 trestles for the railway. Walking that distance before work means rising perhaps 4 a.m. to arrive by 7. Walking home after 10 hours of labour means reaching the village perhaps 7 p.m. or later, exhausted. In darkness during winter months, the train makes work possible. The train also makes work compulsory on the estate's terms. Now consider who lives where. Biltmore village is not an accident of geography. George Vanderbilt purchases the village of Best in 1888 and renames it. He builds worker cottages, estate-owned housing, rent paid to the estate. Most of the workforce lives in these cottages, or at least a substantial portion. Exact figures are unclear in surviving records, but the pattern is documented. So you live in housing owned by your employer, You ride a train operated by your employer. You work at a construction site managed by your employer. You purchase provisions at stores in a village your employer owns. This is what estate records call comprehensive service, what workers might call something else. The payroll ledgers in the Biltmore archives list names and wages, specific figures, daily rates, stonemasons $3.50 per day, the highest tier, skilled craftsmen from Italy, from New York, from cities where architectural stonework is a refined trade requiring years of apprenticeship. Their hands carve the ornamental limestone that will define Biltmore's facade for over a century. Skilled tradesmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, glaziers, plasterers, $2 to $2.50 per day. General labourers $1 to $1.50 per day. An exception appears in the records. George Payne, African-American blacksmith working on the Esplanade. Daily wage $2.25, above general labour rates. Below white skilled tradesman averages, his skill recognised. His race still determining ceiling. A letter from estate management in 1893 notes, there were more African-American employees than white at that time. Modern historians studying payroll records observe that while photographs show workers of different races working side by side, the records suggest segregated crews working in same area, rather than full integration. What this means for daily railway operations is not fully documented, but the pattern emerges. 1893, the railcar transporting workers to the Esplanade breaks down. Supervising architect Richard Sharp Smith writes to management. He requests a new car be provided for white employees in strict accordance with their contract. The letter makes no mention of employees of other races, no mention of how they travelled to work that day, or if they travelled at all. When the system fails, priorities become explicit. 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. This is standard, not negotiable. Estate policy. Construction in the 1890s is dangerous work. Stone dust damages lungs over years of exposure. Heights present constant risk. Heavy materials cause serious injuries. Steam-powered equipment, scaffolding work, sawmills, and brick kilns all carry hazards that workers navigate daily without modern safety equipment. From the railway's start in 1890, estate policy on workplace injury no pay during recovery. 1892, workers petition collectively. The demand half pay for workers injured in the course of their duties, not full wages, not medical coverage, half pay while recovering from injuries sustained building someone else's house. Management agrees. The calculation is clear. Half pay costs less than lawsuits, labour unrest, or damage to the estate's reputation as a benevolent employer. Progress. Also revealing. Workers had to organise, had to petition, had to risk collective action against an employer who controlled their housing, their transportation, their access to provisions, all to receive partial wages when workplace injuries prevented them from continuing the estate's work. Winter 1892. Days shorten. Darkness comes earlier. Carpenters working in the estate's woodshop, a substantial operation producing millions of board feet of finished oak, chestnut, and pine for interior joinery, request a schedule change. 8-hour days during winter months instead of the standard 10. Reason inadequate natural light in shortened days makes precision carpentry difficult and dangerous. Management response. They install electric lights in the workshop. Problem solved. Schedule unchanged. Workers continue 10-hour days. The logic is explicit. Capital investment in lighting is cheaper than reducing labour hours, which would slow construction. So, you work 10 hours daily, 6 days weekly. If you are injured, you now receive half pay instead of nothing but only after petitioning collectively. If winter darkness makes work dangerous, management installs lights rather than shortening days. If the rail car breaks down and you're not white, the archives do not record what happens to you. And through all of this, you depend on infrastructure controlled entirely by the entity that employs you, the railway that brings you to work, the housing you rent, the stores where you purchase food, the school where your children learn, because in 1890s construction, child labour is legal and common practice, not yet prohibited by the reforms that would come decades later. The school exists partly to provide education alongside work that would be illegal today. What is the difference between comprehensive service and total control? Perhaps it is this: in comprehensive service, you have alternatives, other employers, other housing, other transportation, the ability to leave without losing access to everything simultaneously. In total control, everything connects. Lose your job, Lose your housing, lose your transportation, lose your place in the community your employer created and operates. The railway is not just transportation. The railway is the physical manifestation of a system where private wealth controls every variable, where infrastructure designed as practical solution becomes mechanism of dependency. Efficient? Absolutely. The system moves 1,000 workers twice daily with apparent reliability for 5 years. But efficiency is not the same as neutrality. Systems that work well can still encode hierarchy, can still separate by race and class, can still make alternatives impossible. The train arrives at 7 a.m., leaves at 5 p.m., same schedule for everyone, but not the same experience, not the same power, not the same ability to say I choose different terms. That ability belongs to the person who owns the rails. Chapter 4. The Erasure. Christmas Eve, 1895. The house opens. Fires glow in 65 fireplaces. Electric lights wash the rooms. George Vanderbilt welcomes family and friends into 250 rooms spanning 4 acres of floor space. The largest private house in the United States. 6 years of construction, 1,000 workers, 60 stonemasons, 5,000 tons of Indiana limestone, millions of bricks, thousands of board feet of oak and chestnut and pine, all delivered by the railway, all transported 3 miles uphill from Biltmore village on the private spur George built for this purpose. The house is complete. The railway's purpose is fulfilled. What happens to infrastructure when it is no longer needed for public systems? The question involves decades, environmental reviews, public hearings, cost-benefit analyses, political negotiations, union contracts, regulatory approvals. The abandonment of even a single mile of public railway requires legal process, financial settlements, and democratic oversight. For private systems, the question is simpler. Does the owner want to keep it? 1896. Operations wind down. Worker transport needs decrease as construction crews shrink. Bulk material deliveries conclude as finished work requires smaller quantities of specialized items that arrive by wagon. The locomotives are valuable equipment. Steam engines with years of service remaining. George sells them, or repurposes them to other industrial sites. The Baldwin locomotive Biltmore likely finds work at another construction project. Another mine, another mill. Engine number 75. Cherokee probably the same. The third engine disappears from records without clear destination. The rolling stock returns to its sources. Freight cars to the Southern Railway. The borrowed passenger car to wherever it came from. The infrastructure itself dismantles methodically. Crews pull the rails. Standard gauge track is valuable. The steel can be resold or reused elsewhere on the estate. Ties are removed. Timber from the 5 trestles, 1,052 feet of carefully engineered wooden structures likely goes to estate projects or local sale. Nothing is wasted. Everything that can be salvaged is salvaged. Within months, the railway that operated daily for 6 years ceases to exist. The permanent approach road, the 4-mile route Frederick Law Olmsted designed for visitors arriving by carriage, follows an entirely different path. This road winds through recovering forest, revealing vistas in carefully staged sequence, lodge gate to esplanade, building anticipation, creating experience, the railway route left to regenerate. No monuments mark its path, no plaques explain its history. The forest returns. Within a decade, casual observers would not know a railway existed. Within 2 decades, even locals forget the specific route. Today, 129 years later, no visible traces remain on the estate grounds. The trestles are gone. The railbed has vanished under forest regrowth. Archaeological surveys might identify subtle topographic anomalies, slight levelling, compacted earth layers, but to the naked eye, nothing. The Southern Railway depot in Biltmore village still stands. Richard Morris Hunt designed it in 1896, the same year the private spur was dismantled. The depot served the public line, the Southern Railway's main track, not the estate's private railway. Passenger service continued until August 1975. The building now houses a restaurant. Visitors can eat there. They can see the historic structure. They cannot see the private spur that once branched from this point and climbed 3 miles to build the largest house in America. The Biltmore Estate archives preserve photographs. Construction images showing locomotives and trestles and workers with rolling stock. Payroll ledgers listing names and wages. some correspondence about operations. The railway appears in these records because it was integral to construction, but modern Biltmore tours barely mention it. The focus is the house, the gardens, the forestry legacy, George's scientific forest management that eventually contributed 86,700 acres to Pisgah National Forest, the art collection, the preservation story, the architecture. The construction railway receives perhaps one sentence, maybe two. Materials were delivered by a temporary rail line. Workers arrived by train. Brief acknowledgement. Then moving on. This erasure is not cover-up. The information exists in archives. Historians can access it, but it is not prominent, not central to the narrative. The railway becomes an interesting logistics footnote to a larger story about Gilded Age architecture and conservation legacy. Why does this matter? Because disposability reveals privilege in ways permanence cannot. Public infrastructure must justify its existence continuously. Every public railway, every public road, every public utility faces constant scrutiny, cost-benefit analyses, environmental assessments, political debate, community input. The decision to build public infrastructure takes years, sometimes decades. The decision to abandon it takes almost as long. Private infrastructure exists at the owner's discretion. No environmental review required for construction, no public hearings, no cost-benefit analysis published for scrutiny, and when purpose is fulfilled, no approval needed for removal, no political process, no community input. 6 years of comprehensive operations. 1,000 workers transported twice daily. 5,000 tons of limestone delivered. 32,000 bricks moved daily from kilns to construction site. A complete private transportation network with switching, sidings, and multiple destinations. Then gone, within months, leaving almost no physical trace, and within decades, leaving little memory trace. The wealth that builds parallel infrastructure can unmake it just as easily, can erase it from landscape, can erase it from history, can reduce it to footnote. Public systems cannot disappear like this. Public railways leave abandoned rights of way, rusting rails, crumbling trestles, visible scars. They leave legal records of abandonment proceedings. They leave communities affected by closure. They leave historical memory of their importance. Private systems can vanish completely, as if they never existed. That is not just about railways, that is about power. The power to build without permission, to operate without oversight, to dismantle without consultation, to shape the historical record by controlling what remains visible. The Biltmore Construction Railway transported the entire construction workforce twice daily for 6 years. Then it disappeared. The men who rode in open freight cars, exposed to January cold and summer heat, left no monuments. The system that separated them from the stonemasons in passenger cars left no physical evidence. But the precedent remains, the pattern established, the demonstration that sufficient wealth can construct entire systems, use them for private purposes, then erase them when convenient. That is the legacy. Not the rails, not the trestles, not the locomotives. The legacy is the proof that private infrastructure operates on different terms than public systems, accountable to different standards, subject to different rules, or no rules at all. The railway is gone. The power it represented remains. Chapter 5. The Legacy. Here is what the railway reveals about power. 1887. Congress passes the Interstate Commerce Act, creates the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first federal regulatory agency. Its mandate: oversee railroads, require published rates, prohibit discrimination, ensure just and reasonable charges. Revolutionary. For the first time, the federal government claims authority to regulate a private industry. But the ICC has jurisdiction over common carriers, railroads that serve the public for hire across state lines. Private spurs on private property serving private purposes fall outside this definition. If a railway does not cross state lines, does not carry public freight for hire, does not offer common carrier services, the ICC has no clear authority. George Vanderbilt's railway qualifies for none of the ICC's triggers. It operates entirely within North Carolina, serves only estate purposes, charges no public rates, runs on private land, result no rate regulation, no safety oversight, no labor protections, no public accountability. While public railroads file detailed reports showing every charge and every route decision, Vanderbilt's operation answers to no one. This is not illegal. This is the system working as designed, with a built-in exemption for those wealthy enough to build their own infrastructure. The Hepburn Act of 1906 and the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 strengthen ICC authority. But by then, the Biltmore Railway has been dismantled for a decade, private infrastructure built, operated, and removed before regulatory systems catch up. The pattern this establishes persists. Today, Silicon Valley companies provide private buses to employees, bypassing public transit, operating on private schedules serving private purposes, outside transit authority jurisdiction. Gated communities build private roads, private security systems, private utilities, parallel infrastructure for those who can afford to opt out of shared systems, private aviation. The wealthy use private terminals, private jets, private airports, avoiding TSA lines, commercial schedules, capacity constraints everyone else navigates, charter schools, private pandemic response infrastructure, corporate smart cities, exclusive residential developments, same structure, identify public inadequacy, build private alternative, operate outside traditional regulations, serve those with access while everyone else uses constrained public systems. Here is the paradox. The Biltmore Railway helped build an estate that eventually contributed 86,700 acres to Pisgah National Forest, trained America's first scientific foresters through the Biltmore Forest School, preserved architectural and landscape heritage now visited by over 1 million people annually, employs 2,000 workers, sustaining regional economy, genuine public benefit, real innovation, lasting legacy, but that benefit emerged through a system that operated via segregated labor, $1 daily wages, 10-hour days, comprehensive worker dependency, racial hierarchy, class stratification embedded in railway car assignments. Progress and exploitation were not sequential. They were simultaneous. The wealth that funded conservation also funded control. The innovation that trained foresters also transported workers in open freight cars while stonemasons rode enclosed. The preservation that now serves the public began by excluding the public entirely. Can we celebrate the forest while acknowledging the freight cars? Can we value the architecture while naming the wages? Can we recognize innovation while seeing the infrastructure that made alternatives impossible? Or do we accept the justification evolution? Necessity becomes benevolence, becomes right, becomes legacy. Each stage erasing what came before, until the railway disappears, until the workers in open cars disappear, until only the house remains, beautiful, preserved, visited. The Biltmore Construction Railway operated for 6 years, then vanished. But the precedent it set operates still. That sufficient wealth can build systems exempt from shared constraints, can construct parallel infrastructure serving private purposes, can control dependent populations through comprehensive integration, can generate innovation while encoding exclusion, can dismantle without trace when purpose concludes. Infrastructure as temporary tool for some, permanent necessity for everyone else. The railway is gone, the model remains, and we still have not answered its central question. If private wealth builds better systems than public ones, who decides who rides where, who decides what gets built, what gets dismantled, what gets remembered? The answer, 129 years later, has not changed. The person who pays for the rails still decides everything else, still controls access, alternatives, and conditions of transport. The hierarchy remains. That is not history, that is precedent, still operating, still shaping who has access, who has alternatives, who rides in comfort and who rides exposed. The train may be gone, the track may be erased, but the pattern it established remains permanent.